as a way of introducing her work to you, those of you who don't know it. Bracha Lichtenberg Ettinger is an artist, theorist, and practicing psychoanalyst from Israel, living and working in Paris. She has exhibited internationally and published widely. She creates oil paintings and installations from her paintings of images of photographs, pictographs, diagrams, words marked and defaced in colored inks, which have been reproduced many times, sometimes using a photocopier, in what Christine Bucy-Glucksmann calls a grammar of poverty, in a machine process which is able to reproduce, make things far away, and flatten and impoverish the event, and yet also serves as an imprint of a memory or acts of memory, and produce a palimpsest of images. She creates her work and moves forward from the practice of painting and theory, one out of the other. Neither is a theory after the practice, nor vice versa. Her work in these two interconnected modes is concerned to open up the possibility of speaking difference, i.e. the femininity, through a concept of a symbolic psychoanalytic space, which she calls the matrix, and a process which she calls metamorphosis, as roots of, quote, passability, transmissibility, transivity, temporary conductivity, and transference between various psychic strata. The themes of her work cohere and approach what is unique to her as an artist and what is held in common as subjects. Ephemeral traces, memory, her role as a witness to witnesses, the roots of her language. A territory which is a mobile and nomadic between, which proposes routes and ways in which several can coexist, and ways in which the unfigured or foreclosed can come into visual, verbal signification. I first heard Bracha Lichtenberg Ettinger's talk at the Feminist Arts and Histories Network at Leeds University in 1993, where she gave a lecture, keynote lecture, called The Matrixial Gaze, a book which is in the library now. And I would like to quote from Griselda Pollock's introduction to that lecture, in which she stresses the need for a space. I think this applies to all practice, for artistic work that is difficult, challenging, and operating at the limits of our current understanding. Work that is perhaps not always immediately accessible, but is not intended to be obscure or esoteric in order to exclude particular people who don't know the theory. But she says, as an interrogation of psychoanalysis itself, as a resource for feminist approaches to art, to the operation of art, and to aesthetic practices. And Pollock says it is genuinely difficult stuff. This is because, as an artist theorist, Bracha Lichtenberg Ettinger is working at the limits of her chosen field, and because psychoanalysis is a very demanding body of thought about the nature of human subjectivity. On the other hand, despite having to struggle with these limits, I was able also to, on the advice of this introduction, which I pass on here, quote, not to struggle for instant mastery, to listen to the unfolding thought, to tune in and out, take what makes sense and allow the argument to travel its pathways, which will arrive at places that subtly make sense of things that in some ways many feel that have already been intuited, known in some yet unspoken way. The major concern this artist lies with these potential meanings and pre-meaning sensations that hover at the very threshold of human subject. So I'm looking forward to her talk and to this journey with you. So I'm pleased to please join me in welcoming Bracha Lichtenberg Ettinger.
Thank you, Nina Danino and Mark Cousins, for inviting me to this very prestigious school. And maybe to take up from what Nina just said, those of you who don't feel that they know the psychoanalytic theory enough to be able to work through the theory, maybe I can take it that you suggest that they will just put in their poetic antenna and relax, and it doesn't matter. You can understand it, I think, also not exactly in a theoretical way, and maybe Mark, you can charge the theory for you later on. the gaze and the screen in what we call in psychoanalysis the scopic magnitude in the psychic field of vision are not regulated by optical laws, by laws of geometry or of perspective, or even by those of physical light and shadow. Neither are they regulated by the physiology of the eye, nor by the thinking person and the thinking reason. No subjective instance and no mental object are entirely embraced or limited by the place that such regularity functions might accord for them, because the nourishing context of the psychic field of vision is the human psyche itself. The way psychoanalytic theory conceives of the human psyche and in its basis of sexuality, and the way it conceives of subject and object, is therefore determining for understanding the gaze, the tableau, the painting, and visuality in their links to the unconscious. Freud connected the visual drive to mastery. In Lacan's theory, and especially the period that interests me here, from 64 to 67, a phallic gaze comes into light as a mental vanishing trace of the action of drives, of what we want in life and what we want to access. And the relations of the artist and viewer with the painting are compared to the subject relations to object and to others in fantasy. The playground of these relations is archaic sexuality, and their hidden blueprint is male's positioning with regards to it. Now, this is not something I specially claim. This is something that Lacan confesses himself about 10 years later than the 60s here. Indexing absence of contact with the psychic originary thing resulting from an incision from the other as body, the other as my body, the other as the body of the mother. This is what he calls the objet A, object little a. It engenders the subject along few unconscious dimensions, and vision is a privileged one of them. The objet A is a leftover of the activity of the drive in the real, a leftover, a kind of a trace. The object A is a cleft from the subject as well as from the other, and it has no direct representation by image. This means that in the process of psychological growth, we are, and in the process of coming into contact with what we want, we must lose something. And he names this loss objet A. In the field of vision, such a split and lost objet A is the gaze, is what we call the gaze. It is a remnant of the drive's trajectory of reaching for object. It is a leftover of inaccessible bodily samplings of my own corporeality and of that of the other. Split from the subject and split from the other, such a gaze is for Lacan an absence, a libidinal loss. Even though the gaze is based on an unconscious phallic structure, it was displayed as sexually neutral, under the assumption that male sexual difference is the only sexual difference accessible for human knowledge, not the only that exists, but the only sexual difference that we can access to knowledge, and that its mechanism of loss, which is called castration, is the only possible source of human desire. I will present a parallel psychic activity, not of drives as internal and autonomous, but of the erotic antenna of the psyche, which engenders a transsubjective, not even intersubjective, psychic sphere that I have named matrixial. Here another kind of gaze, uncleft, but it doesn't mean that it is fused with the subject or with the other, is unfolded in psychic life. The activity of the erotic antenna of the psyche, waking up in tuning with encounters and with events, always joining in separating with and from the other, is modeled upon a special kind of contact, on a traumatic differentiating in jointness between me and what we may call the archaic mother, the archaic other mother. The gaze, this psychic visual entity which escapes us, the gaze, that corresponds to such an activity, is not a lost object of fantasy, but a link. It's not a loss, but a link between trauma and fantasy. What I have called a matrixial borderline and later on a metamorphic border link. The desire that corresponds to its activity is not a desire for a lost object, but for linking with the other. The gaze is a vacillating trace of an almost missed link, or what Lacan will call rapport maybe, of border linking with that which is not me, which is not me even if it is already in me, but is not me in terms of my knowledge. The matrixial gaze, or object A, is a trace of this separation in jointness, which is not an incision or a cut from the archaic mother. Here, not an object is lost, if anything, but a link is ebbing and flowing while co-emerging and co-fading with the other. The matrixial psychic sphere is a space of encounters and their trails, traces of my traumatic encounter with my non-I. And when I say my non-I, it is to make us aware that not just any other concern me and not just any other becomes my non-I or my other, to which I must become aware in order to somehow psychically survive. These traces and imprints of events experienced by me and not me, what I should call I and non-I, because I don't intend the self, but fragmented and assembled partial subject, yet uncognized by me as an entire subject in self-identity. In such a border linking of I and non-I, my fantasy is not purely mine. Not only am I concerned by my own traumas, and not only the encounter with the other is to me traumatic, but I'm also concerned by the trauma of the other, which I did not directly experience. A matrixial gaze comes to light if we assume an originary unconscious and sexual difference, a feminine sphere related to female body, where such transmissivity is possible, and from which it filters to the general human awareness. The matrixial gaze is not purely visual, and it enters visuality, disturbs it, and changes the painting, because it penetrates and alters the scopic field of vision, the psychic field of vision, which by definition is already impure. It is impure because it is inseparable from other unconscious dimensions of the psyche, and it is informed by different sources of sensibility. And it is also connected, and that's one of the points I'm making, to the unconscious of others. The scopic sphere of vision is veiled by the painting, and what Lacan calls the gaze vibrates beyond that appearance. It disturbs representation because this baggage of archaic sexuality lingered behind it, lacking for him and split from ever from the passions of the eye to see. And even though originally a part of the other, it now evades both the other and my desiring eye. And it deposits its baggage in another obstructed fabric that in a projective plan behind, outside of the sight, and before, outside of the time of the painting. For Lacan, the eye and the gaze, my passioning eye if you want, and the gaze are forever cleft, secluding what is shown to the subject from what it desires to see. The other doesn't look at me from where I look at him. This is a very famous passage from Lacan in 1964, nor from where I would like him to look at me. And what I look at, he says, is never what I wish to see. This is a quote from 1964. When I look for the gaze, it hides, and precisely for that reason, the field of vision is relevant to unconscious subject, because the splits form the possibility that through the eye we are going to desire. Now, the gaze as a lack implies for Lacan not only a lacking object, but also the impossibility of intersubjectivity. Intersubjective relations are precisely, says Lacan in 1965 in an unprinted seminar, are precisely the absence indexed by the gaze. It is a lack to being, a dimension from which we are cleft, an impossible point of emergence, a mythical origin. And I'm going to quote Lacan, forgive me for the translation. Here it goes. And remember what I said the tableau is, the painting is, the real tableau. It is the gaze. It is the tableau that gazes at whomever is caught in its field and falls in its snare. The painter is he who makes the gaze fall before himself from the other. The figure is projected before him, the figure of he who no longer knows from whence he sees himself, who no longer knows the point from which he gazes upon himself. The somewhere from which everything falls into position for the subject, it must be emphasized, has no point. It is that outside, which is the point of birth, the point of emergence of some creation, which may be from the order of a reflection, of the order of the secretly organized, of that which falls into position, of that which is constituted as intersubjectivity. With regard to this light, which appears suddenly on the very image of the one whose name is lost, of the one who is presented here as lack, Freud leaves the thing in suspense for us, leaves us a kind of a tongue-tied, so to speak. It is the apparition of the point of emergence in the world from the bursting forth point, which in language can only be translated as the lack to being. End of quote. So whether in this analysis of painting and the gaze of aesthetic experience is a lack in terms of a phallic ghost, or in terms of an absent intersubjectivity based on this lack of being of the encounter with the mother, in any case we can say that for Lacan, the archaic other mother as experiencing sensible body as an encounter in the real, as a point of emanation of psychic life, is a phantom. This phantom is outside the tableau in the sense that you don't see it there, but at the same time, Lacan's call here the gaze precisely the tableau, in the sense that the gaze is the specific artistic and aesthetic dimension that distinguish a tableau from any other visual image. The gaze is what makes it function as a work of art, and not just as any other object among the objects of the world. Since the other, this other los, objet art, thing, whatever you name it, is for Lacan a woman, and on that we will have to give another lecture, and the gaze in art is an elevation of that woman as absence to the level of the thing, which is even more absent than you can imagine, even more absent than woman, and the impossibility of feminine, what he calls feminine sexual rapport, even if this other is positioned in relation to a particular woman and her specific experience, it is still lacking in a kind of a lack that is structured as a phallus. The phallus for Lacan is whatever can be thought of in place of the missing mother, and it is the support of the absence in the figure of the gaze or of the objet art. I quote, just to show you that I don't hallucinate, "The other is mother." I quote it because it's a question for psychoanalysis and what Lacan means. The other with a big O is mother. And then, of course, the other doesn't exist. Woman doesn't exist. Her sexual jouissance signifies nothing to her, and there is no sexual rapport. All these terms define the space of the lack, and the space of the absence, which can arouse in us desire. This is a rapport which would have been feminine had it existed and had it signified something. But in this model, just as women cannot have any other access to the feminine rapport, and castration is her only splitting link to it, the link here is a split. In the same way, the artist can't have any other access to the gaze except working through the skiz, working through the cut. In this model, desire cannot intervene outside, because outside is also before the fantasy framework. And what is desired cannot desire. Thus we enter art here and the understanding of the desire in art through the psychic field of vision and via the real that Lacan says spreads between trauma and fantasy. This is the field. And as we enter that field, we of necessity enter the field of libido and the field of sex difference. In psychoanalysis, that's how it is, whether we like it or not. We cannot make this separation and say, I speak about the psyche, I speak about passion or desire or any other important term. I speak about narcissism, for example, without understanding that we are speaking of modes of understanding of sexual difference. In Lacanian psychoanalytic perspective, we approach art, therefore, via phallic holes in the real that are split from the subject, even if these holes are precisely the impossible feminine sexuality as rapport, as link. Painting can only incarnate the whole of feminine sexuality as what Lacan's, I quote, the phallic ghost. And the aesthetic effect, like Freud claimed, spring from its proximity, it's a quote again, to the castration complex. But according to Freud himself, and I analyzed it in a book which is called The Matrixal Gaze, according to Freud himself, enigmatic aesthetic reactions are also attached to the unconscious infantile complex of intrauterine existence or to womb fantasies. However, such fantasies are also considered by Lacan as handling phallic holes to be foreclosed precisely what we must put aside. And any sense attributed to their apparition is disregarded as mysticism and obscurantism. And I would like to say that Kristeva's remark that the pregnancy appears in a culture as psychosis is precisely this Lacanian's refusal of giving any other kind of meaning to that sphere. In the move that I will suggest of reflecting on art in terms of trauma and in terms of the matrix, I am claiming that the matrixal border space draws another sex difference where the aesthetic anxiety receives another or supplementary meaning. A matrixal erotic antenna of the psyche, always joining while separating from the other, is modeled upon a special kind of a swerve, a difference, and a link that leaves traces on a differentiating potentiality and operation in the field of emotive sensibility, which participate in traumatic differentiating from the eye, of the eye from the other, which is always also a joining and cannot be considered as entirely split, at least from that perspective, not from all perspective, but from that perspective. Now I will draw the field in psychoanalytic terms, and then we will try to move to aesthetics. Already before birth, now I would like to say one note, because for any psychoanalyst who is also considering himself Lacanian, this is a kind of a blasphemy. Lacan says, and I quote, something like, no one who considers himself to be a psychoanalyst, and precisely a Lacanian psychoanalyst, can say anything about the prenatal. And this is his opinion during the 60s, the late 60s. I think that he's changing it, but he's changing it too late in an article I translated from the 80s, from 1980. But he does not explain this article, so it's a bit too late for Lacanians who leans on him very, very directly. Already before birth, in the late prenatal period, the subject to be aspires in fantasy and contacts traumatically a woman in whose trauma, fantasy, and desire she already participates. The jouissance, the sensible or enjoying or painful event that spurts on the level of this encounter, and the links between the trauma and the fantasy of me, of the becoming subject, male or female, and the trauma, fantasy, and desire of the woman who will become, later on, its archaic mother, both of them in the status of what we should call partial subjects and partial objects. I don't say part object, I say partial objects for each other, constitute a matrixial cluster of desire meeting with reality and trauma meeting with fantasy. Archaic traces of contact with female body are engraved. They are remembered without recollecting and revealed in a fantasy saturated with imprints of trauma of this shared trans-subjectivity. Now, I'm not saying that this female dimension concerns only women or females. Far from that. But there is a connection which is quite vital and important to understand to the female body, in a way parallel to the fact that castration have some connections with male body. It is not only that, but it has these connections. And therefore, I will term it like that, which is not exact. Female subjects have a double, at least, access to the matrixial sphere in the real, not in art. Because they experience the womb or their body, the specificity of their body, both as an archaic outside and past side, out of chronological time, as anterior, which is true for male subjects just as well, and as an inside and future sight, whether it is actual, future, or posterior time. Whether they are mothers or not, it doesn't matter to this question. This time out of time is a potentiality for repetition which might get actualized, where the outside and past side are both females and males in the reality of the body, in the scale of the body. This inside and future side are females only, in the body, and as bodily potentiality. Female subjects have therefore a kind of a privileged access to this paradoxical time where future traumatically meets the past, and to this paradoxical site where outside meets inside. And when I say privilege, I don't mean that they can gain from that more pleasure. Maybe even the contrary. Maybe they can gain from it some kind of a surplus of fragility. Aside of art's time and space, out of art, male subjects are more radically split from this archaic site of potentiality, since their link with it stays in the archaic outside and the too early, that is forever too late to accessing in the real of a separate body. Men, however, are in contact with this time and side, affected, like women, by joining in difference with others in what we call in psychoanalysis transference relations and via art. As an aesthetic filter, as an artistic filter, I should say, the matrixial apparatus serves whoever can yield and tolerate this fragile, fragmented, and disparate positioning. Various non-conscious lanes that are open towards and from this difference are not limited then to women only, though they do carry a special resonance for women when they resonate or treasure or filter these bodily vibrations. The matrixial sphere, therefore, in the psyche, is a border space for channeling waves, for transcripting imprints, for tracing and exchanging traces from traumatic and enjoying encounters. These, I claim, are mounted on an unconscious lane opened by the archaic events of encounter with the mother, which are transmitted to me and are what I call cross-scribed, a scription from you to me and from me to you, and of course repressed. These traces and imprints are experienced by I and non-I, by me and by other, my others, as fragmented and assembled partial subject, not as me and you in self-identity. Now, what I'm saying here is that not only I am concerned by my own wounds, and not only that the encounter with the other is traumatic for me, like which would be a very an idea of Levinas, though he might not agree with me on that interpretation. Not only that, I'm also concerned by the trauma of the other, what it does to him, not what it does to me, what it did to him. The matrixial and conscious sphere is a border space of simultaneous co-emergence and co-fading with the other. And there I repeat things I've already printed here and there, but it must be maybe clear for those who hear me for the first time, that it is not a fusion and it is not a possibility for rejection. These both possibilities, both rejection and fusion, are phallic possibilities of conceiving of the matrixial. Composite partial subjectivity produces, shares, and transmits assembled hybrid, and diffracted object, or objet A, or gaze if you want, through these border links. The matrixial, if it's modeled upon a certain conception of feminine and pre-birth intimate sharing, yet the womb is conceived here not primarily as an organ of receptivity or an origin or whatever you want, but as a psychic capacity for shareability. A capacity for what I call differentiation in co-emergence and separation in jointness. And where distance in proximity is continually reattuned, I have to negotiate my distance from the other in a continuous way. I cannot decide it, and I cannot surely decide it once and for all. I therefore say that I and non-I, parts of our subjectivity, are creating border links between themselves, between ourselves, and creating their own affects. And therefore I'm speaking of relations without relating. And if you'll stay with the image, now I'll say with the image, but not with the reality of the womb, you will realize what I mean by relations without relating. Whether I like it or not, I am relating without an awareness of this relatingness. On the border of presence and absence, of subject and object, not because this in-between space is in itself something that becomes apparent, and Lacan talks about this in-between in 75, but because in this kind of transsubjectivity it is not possible to imagine, it is not possible to begin from this kind of separation. Traces circulate in a transsubjective zone by matrixial affects and by the erotic antenna of the psyche that disperse different aspects of traumatic events between me and several others, and to begin with, between me and my mother. And thus, as I cannot fully handle events that concern me profoundly, they are fading in transformation, while my non-I, my other, becomes witness and what I call witness to them. You will realize here that I'm approaching already what is for me the function of the work of art, and what is maybe the role of the artist role. So, if then because of highly traumatic value of events, I cannot psychically contain my wounds at all, in the matrixial psychic sphere, my imprints will be transcribed as traces in the other. Thus, my other will process traumatic events for me. Like my archaic mother had metabolized archaic events for my premature and fragile partial subjectivity. The matrixial feminine difference emerges here not as an essential quality, but not as a social construct. And I'd like to stress this because I think that psychoanalysis finds its place in this kind of discourse that intends art, because it has some kind of specificity, and one of them is that we are not obliged to either turn to essentiality or to social reality. A trans-subjective figure is interlaced, whose psyche is not confined to one body, but is a weaving of links between partial subjects and partial objects. I've called this possibility of creating links in that way a metamorphosis. And it is responsible, this metamorphosis, is a kind of a potentiality for reciprocal and yet non-symmetrical crossing of borders between fantasy and trauma, between I and non-I. It induces, if you want, instances of this kind of co-emergence and of transsubjectivity. And it induces transcription as the inoubliable memory of oblivion. I take the words memory of oblivion both from my writings and from the writings of Lyotard, who gave it a very special and very wonderful meaning. A treasuring of events one cannot recollect because they have been treated by one's own original repression, but also transcripted from the other and in the other. The idea of transcription is therefore a pluri or several and cross-scription. And I intend to suggest it to you as a means of thinking the enigma of the prints of the world on the artist, of the artist's potentiality to transform the world's hieroglyphs, this is Freudian word, and of the viewer capacity to join in this process and be active in this process. When in art a sense emerges, it offers meaning for what has just been born and would otherwise be foreclosed or even psychotic because it was born from somebody else in me, or vice versa. Metamorphosis, then, is a process of affective linking and inscriptive exchange between several matrixial entities. Engravings of affected events of the other and of the world are unknowingly inscribed in me, and mine are inscribed in others, known or anonymous, in an asymmetrical exchange that creates and then transforms the junction itself and the assemblage itself. Matrixial memory of event, paradoxically, both of oblivion, both in oblivion, and inoubliable, unforgettable, a memory charged with a freight that a linear story cannot tell, is transmitted and cross-scribed. This memory affects our erotic antenna, our compassioning and our languishing eyes, or our scopic desire. It also carries dispersed signifiers, all kinds of words, then the dear of the said of the mother or the not said of the mother, to borrow someone else's expression. It carries to be elaborated in further links because I cannot elaborate them, but somebody else might. Fragmented traces of the event's complexity from inside and outside and out of chronological time and even historical time, we can talk about what is historical time for us, compose fractured and diffracted, unforgettable memory of oblivion that cannot be entirely inscribed in either me or you, but only transcribed and transmitted when transformed through the work of art. Such a transcription of intimate yet anonymous encounter concerns artist and viewer facing the painting, the tableau, in different ways, in different times and sites. On the poetic matrixial plane, I could say that I know in the world by my erotic tuning, and that other effectively knows in my work, where the world's traces are transformed and engraved. Such knowing of and in the other is a transgression which transforms the frontier itself between me and not me, or between what I insist to say I and non-I. The gaze, rather than being a lack, becomes an erotic antenna embedded within coaffectation, whose wave makes sense as a transformation on that level. Such is an impossibility of not sharing. Now, if in the phallus we are looking for ways of understanding how sharing is possible at all, how intersubjectivity is possible. And you may know that Lacan started his thinking with intersubjectivity and then left it, and then stopped to believe it. If you are looking in the phallic frame, how to think exchange and sharing, in the matrix there is an impossibility of a total not sharing. Whether you like it or not, what I'm saying, in this sphere you are sharing. And this is profoundly fragilizing position. It demands its price, and it originates its own beauty and its own aesthetic affects and effects. Apparitions from traumatic cross-inscriptions are known, even though what is told is not a story, and what is seen illustrates nothing. What is seen is not an illustration, and I think you as architect knows more about it even than painters. Matrixial awareness channels the subject desire towards the trauma of the other, who by definition is therefore not a total other. If it's affective border linking, if it is effectively border linked to me. In the same way that my awareness cannot master you via your traces in my psyche, there is no joining in the matrixial gaze which would be without separation. It's not a sticking together for life or death, and it's not symbiosis, and it's not fusion. The desire to join in differentiating with the painting, like with the other, doesn't promise any harmony. That's another point. Nobody promises happiness while you are joining. It's not a kind of a lost paradise. And we cannot think of the matrix as a lost paradise or a hell on the other side. Because joining is first of all with the other's wound that echoes backwards to my own archaic traumas, and therefore provoke a risk of fragmentation and of dispersal. The matrixial gaze upsurges a desire for dangerous encounters. On the ethical plane, the matrixial accessibility implies becoming vulnerable in the sense of Levinas. In the matrixial shareability, I am being exposed to the other to the point where the other becomes traumatizing to me. Metamorphic rapport is then an erotic co-responsibility in the sense, I think the deep sense of Levinas. Levinas says that the moment I set my eyes on you, I'm already responsible to you. Now this is a crazy thing, and it is, how can I be responsible to what happened to you yesterday? I only come to know you right now. So in Levinas' sense, this responsibility is beyond time, or is another conception of time itself. And this is this kind of fragility on a more ethical level, which I'm not dealing with much here, because I'm dealing with the aesthetic. I will end with some remarks on the more direct remarks on the link of all that to contemporary art. And I think this is my thesis here in a way, that artists in the last at least 20 years, artists that I care about, at least there is a choice here, are dealing with this kind of transmission of trauma. You may think of films like Egoyen, like you may think of video of Bill Viola, you may think of some paintings. The list is not big, not small, but I think that there is a kind of a sensibility to the question of this kind of trauma that arise in the art of now, because in a way we cannot avoid anymore a certain reality in which we are living in this kind of a post-traumatic era. And therefore I think that to conceive of art today, we have to move from concepts like reality, concept even, or fantasy, to trauma, in a move to the matrixial sphere, and not, and this is another limitation, not being limited by the phallic scope to think trauma. I think that we are carrying in this second half of the 20th century enormous traumatic weight, and we are living it through its massive transitive effects. And art brings this into the surface of culture. And therefore, whatever it is that attracts us, call it the beautiful, call it what you name your attraction to an artwork, it proposes new possibilities for affective apprehension of this transitivity, while producing new effects of the impossibility of not sharing. While you are metamorphosing yourself with the work, you find yourself swerving in a dangerous proximity to an event, as if you have always been potentially sliding on its margins. You are threatened by this swerve and by this rapport, and yet you are also attracted by a mysterious, what Nietzsche calls promise of happiness. This is how Nietzsche tried to define beauty. He says, we don't know what it is, but there is some kind of a promise of happiness, and that's why I stay there. I stay there. I don't run away in horror from the work of art. A promise to re-find what faded away and got dispersed, but on condition of fragilizing yourself, since this kind of affect is the effect of border linking to a wound and of co-emerging with the traumatized other. And I will end with some remarks on the matrixial gaze. The matrixial gaze conducts imprints from one paradox that Loeb and Feldman talked about, the events without witnesses, which is a nice, very interesting paradox. And it passed them to another paradox, to witnesses who were not there, to witnesses without event. It is this paradoxical conjunction of impossible witnessing via this witnessing that I have called witnessing with the H in between. How you call it in English, I don't know. Such are both the artist and the viewer in different ways. The viewer will embrace traces of the almost missing event while transforming it, and while transforming itself, by weaving via the tableau its own metamorphosis to others, present and archaic, cognized and uncognized, future and past. The viewer is challenged by the tableau to join a specific anonymous intimate encounter, a specific, not just any. Its gaze is carried by an event she did not experience. And through the matrixial web, an unexpected affective reaction to it arises. And therefore, I would like to stop with this, though the paper doesn't stop with that. I will say that I think that we are dealing today with art which moves from the aesthetic to a space which was more classically defined in between aesthetics and ethics, we could say. There is a slight move that the aesthetic cannot be anymore confined to the aesthetic. And this is a question I will leave open maybe. And thank you very much.
An argument which is obviously quite dense and which may have been kind of new to people, that perhaps sort of first of all we might take kind of questions really which are concerned with clarification and elucidation of the argument. And then when that seems to come to a kind of natural halt, move on to a more substantive discussion of the issues. So does anyone have a question or questions about the clarification of any of the terms, concepts, or their argument? Here.
Say it again?
I was wondering about, you used the notion post-traumatic reality.
Yeah.
I wonder if you could say something more about that.
Well, it's a kind of a way to try to point to a reality both internal and external, if you want. And it's a way of saying that that we are not, that if there was the illusion of innocence, then I think that now, in the end of the 20th century, no artist and no creator and no human being can pretend innocence, and that nobody can pretend not to be taken inside the reality, the traumatic reality of the other. I mean, you can continue, but it would not, I think, really fit the... So this is what I mean by that. But still we are, born more innocent than later on, and so on and so on. But as a cultural idea, this is the idea.
Eric.
We need there is a microphone.
To go back to your engagement with trauma, I presume that these are just assumptions that I'm making, and I'd like to sort of a little bit of elaboration. You're talking about trauma as a structure, right? It's not a condition, it's a structure, which then has certain levels of cultural embeddedness. One of the ways in which trauma is really interested in me as a historical structure is that it seemed to be a possibility to write history through symptoms rather than through originary events. And so I found it a very interesting model for trying to think historically.
Yeah.
But I mean, what you're talking about is a kind of creating living through a structure. And it was that I wanted you to sort of perhaps elaborate on.
Yeah.
It strikes me that relation, what you were saying, I couldn't quite understand the relation between originary events, symptoms, and their representation.
Yeah. But for that, to take it on, maybe you can say some more words for everybody. What do you mean by symptoms and the connection of trauma to symptom?
Oh, I think, I don't want to hijack the discussion.
No, I think it's very important, but we may accumulate misunderstanding.
Are you calling trauma a symptom?
No, what I'm saying is that the sort of Freudian model of trauma seemed to be an interesting way of trying to think about certain accounts and narrations of history, because rather than sort of following some kind of path that assumes that there's an originary event that one can name and date and locate, etc., one is basically living off a set of clues that are in the given culture, which one can recreate a possible narrative without vouching for its validity.
Anything comes before. Yeah. No, but this is a very important point. That's why I wanted you to Freud defined a set of trauma. And this set of trauma are also defining the special mechanism, the primary mechanism of relating to the world, libidinally and narcissistically. Okay? Now, the trauma are very specific. Not everything can become traumatic. You have castration, right? You have a few scenarios, and you have to organize your understanding of trauma and symptom and the world, if you want, or of myself, around these 3 or 4, the primal scene, the castration, the Oedipal, and so on and so on. You don't have endless. And then with theory of object relations, it was opened to the field of intersubjectivity, and there are some few more traumatic scenarios that enters. They are, of course, pointed by Freud, but not in the same way, which is the loss of the object and the loss of the love of the object to me, right? So we have here already, I just named at least 5 traumatic thing, whatever it is, that can get a status of trauma and understanding of trauma, and therefore understanding of how you deal with the trauma and how you observe it by symptoms. So when I talk about trauma, of course I'm not saying it comes before that or it is better. I'm saying that this structure proposed by Freud and continued by object relation, we must continue it. And the way to continue it is both backward and forward in a way. You see? Once you discover something that relates, you don't know if to you or to the world, through the work of art, then it spreads both ways. It spreads to what could be a trauma and how we can define it, and what we can find in stories psychoanalyst tells us, and what other stories we can add to the picture. You see? Now, I don't think that Freud gave up on the word originary, at least when we speak about originary repression. So again, the question is, what do we repress? Huh? Do we only repress this scenario, or do we repress something else? So of course, we are talking also about what kind of repression, what kind of mechanism of repression, and so on.
I mean, maybe we could try and kind of elucidate the sort of problem of trauma, because I think it's kind of central to your argument. I mean, another way of sort of questioning it would be to say that obviously for Freud, the question of trauma, and this is why, as it were, he so consistently refuses to say anything consistent about trauma, is that in a sense it's an economic issue. That is to say, it's important to recognize that for Freud there aren't kind of events which are traumatic. The trauma automatically is a kind of relational issue between the economy of the subject and the issue. That is to say, some things may be traumatic for some people and not for others. If you ask what's the difference, that sort of leads on to the next stage, which is for those who have to repress, for those who don't have, what at that stage you would have been calling unbound psychic energy, bound psychic energy, to kind of spare, they're going to be, and their investment is, as it were, in repression or in other defenses, then they're much more likely to be traumatized, kind of by an event. Therefore, the question for Freud is always also the ratio between the trauma and kind of neurosis, which is to say that in order to treat a trauma, you don't treat the trauma, you treat the neurosis. Because, as it were, it's
and
that.
You don't treat the symptom.
Well, in that sense, there isn't a symptom of a. I think it would be easier to talk about effects of the trauma. If one wants to say, continuous weeping, I don't call that a symptom. I call that an effect. Or the repetition of the event in dreams or in kind of waking consciousness. It is like an effect rather than a kind of symptom. It's there as that which can't be worked through. Now, it seems to me that that kind of way in which one talks about trauma in a sort of economic sense and how it articulates to kind of neurosis is not really the way in which, well, this is the question, is not really the way in which you're kind of discussing the issue of trauma.
Yeah. Though it is not in contrast with it, because the question still remains the innocence, in a way, of the subject. the subject, the moment the subject can deal with whatever it could become traumatic is, first of all, after birth, and this was already a discussion in Freud's time and Otto Rank and all that. They sort of stopped a little moment on the trauma of birth itself, the possibility there is something enough subjectively there to be able to absorb or contract or anything that would be traumatic. Then Freud said, no, this is, and Lacan, of course, also said this is in times, in relation to time. This is not possible to deal with. And then we do start with the proportion of what you are saying, the disponibility of the libido, of the energy, the forces of the psyche to cope with the event, and the enormity or non-enormity of the outside event and how they can play from a certain moment on in the personal life of the subject.
Right.
So, in a way, I'm not rejecting this description. I'm saying we must maybe add something to that in terms of, that's what I'm trying to do in any case.
Where does it fit with the gaze?
Sorry?
Where does it fit with the gaze? I mean, I came to hear about the gaze and trauma.
Yeah, okay. In the beginning, I said that the gaze for psychoanalysis, right? And I think for many models who use psychoanalysis knowingly and unknowingly, because many people use the gaze of Lacan as if it is just any gaze, it is as if it is looking. So I try to frame it and say that in psychoanalysis and in Lacanian psychoanalysis, the gaze in itself is a mini structure inside a larger structure of fantasy. The way that the gaze is an object of fantasy. The gaze is not me looking at you. The gaze is not what I see. The gaze is an object of fantasy, okay? Now, if the gaze, I will just say one line, if the gaze is an object of fantasy, then the way I understand fantasy and the way I understand the internal relationship in fantasy to the gaze are going to determine what is it that I wish to see. Okay? So it is not a physical entity, but it is the relations there between subject and fantasy, and we must add, I think, subject and trauma, but maybe you will say.
Well, I mean, if I was like to take up that issue, I mean, it seemed to me, though I may have misunderstood it in the presentation, that in a sense, first of all, you're seeking to kind of supplement the traditional account of the gaze with the matrixical, which stands in a kind of which is articulated in some sense through trauma. But what it struck me about what you were saying, if anything, is that in a way you're talking about two different orders of seeing. I mean, to view it very crudely. The gaze does indeed kind of concern itself with what you might call the kind of image as kind of the pictorial, or I mean, it doesn't matter about pictorial, but is about kind of object seen. The second, really in a way, kind of concerns itself with a kind of secretive form of inscription, the matrixical. I mean, that is to say, it was that which kind of resisted being, and I think it would be right to say read rather than kind of seen, and as if precisely you couldn't read the kind of inscriptions that you yourself incorporate, only someone else could kind of do that. But it did seem that there were these, in a sense, that part of the distinction between the two registers almost posed itself as a contrast between the conventionally visual and, as it were, this kind of inscriptional, some sort of kind of grapheme
Yeah.
whose appropriate form of kind of intelligibility is through a certain kind of act of, I don't know what to call it, reading.
Okay, now I want to say something. The articulation of the matrixial gaze with trauma is what I'm doing the last 2 years. Because not because this one conditioned the other, or the one comes from the other, but because I'm doing a kind of a work which elaborates itself to get into this matrixial sphere on many, many different levels of the way we describe subjectivity in psychoanalysis. So right now it came very strongly to the question of trauma. But it is not, we are not going to go back, I hope to go forward and not go back to the idea that body, would finally end up as female and inscription will end up as male, and maybe I'm going to inverse it. Not at all. What I'm saying that in the phallic domain, and Lacan gave a fantastic, I think, illustration of that. You cannot pretend that it is phallic only in the symbolic, but then not in the body, or in the imaginary, not in the real, and so on. In fact, it's a kind of a massive filter of processing all kind of levels of reality. So I think that it puts up the question of inscription, as well as the question of how we see, as well as the question of the real and of the body, and so on. In any case, what I was articulating today is mainly through the question of where is it inscribed, as you say, not even how, not here, not now, though I treated it, where it is inscribed, and so from where we can track it.
Sorry.
Trauma becoming the subject and trauma of others is great.
Sorry? I can't hear you.
Trauma of the others' trauma and trauma becoming the subject. Never leave the house again, so it's free without things were that difficult. So if you're actually making a work of art, regardless of what you ask, the language you're using, what are you asking people to witness when you make something?
Sorry?
What are you asking people to witness when you make something? What are you asking them to be sensitive to? I understand the language you're using, and I think very few artists would think in that way before they've done something for a piece of work, or design and think. And your work is very particularly direct to that.
Well, for me too, I can only give witness to the fact that my ideas and thinking, and not even very articulated yet, comes out of the work. The work comes first, and then I start to try to see what I wanted, what did I say, and so on. I can give no instruction and not know, what to do and how to do and what content. I don't know. I mean, it remains quite a secret what makes it work, and then you can account for how it worked for you.
You seem to be saying something about trauma and the gaze, which people commonly recognise in each other.
Yeah.
In the sense that they kind of recognise.
I think it is intuited in our reality, absolutely. But I think that the way it is formalized or elaborated is not sensible to that.
Sorry, there was a question actually behind.
Shout, because I can't hear anymore.
Bracha, what's special about today?
What's special about today?
Yes, I mean, you talked about the sensibility of trauma in today's art, yeah? And I wonder why you put the stress upon
I think that
today's
today...
art. Sorry, can I just...
Yeah, okay.
Because also I'd like to use trauma in, not just in its psychoanalytic sense. I mean, the sense in which there is a kind of way in which one could describe historical events and social events in the 20th century. If you move to another framework, to a Marxist framework, then you can describe certain kinds of class relations or social relations in terms of trauma.
Yeah.
So in that respect, from from Adorno through to Jameson, there are many moments within the 20th century which would be given the ascription of traumatic. So
Yeah.
why is there any particular reason, apart from the fact that we're talking about, in the present?
Yes,
to put that
because
weight
I
on the
think
present.
that these were intending, and the theories were intending, the trauma that you or your friends are going through. Are we okay until there? And that what I'm trying to say is a trauma that is transmitted already to us, that we are like a héritière, I don't know how to say it, of trauma. And it's not about, coming to the society, you realize a wrong is done to you, or you realize a wrong is done to me, or I realize a wrong is done to me and I'm going to make a revolution. I think this is something else now. And I think that the artists are working on it, the way I see it, from about after the Second World War. I think it became such a dense, unknown awareness, you see? And maybe it has to do with the fact that we cannot anymore say I didn't know this or I didn't know that. There is no way to avoid huge communication. I mean, this is no way to avoid networking and behind screen networking and so on and so on. So it has to do both with events and with awareness to events. And of course, my hope is that this can serve to formulate things not only in psychoanalysis, but psychoanalysis is where I can formulate them the most precisely. No, trauma is not knowledge.
Then how do you, when you say it's knowing, becoming aware, becoming conscious?
Usually I call it sub-knowledge, and we wouldn't be able to get into it, but it's a question I analyzed in length with the question which I think this question raised also, and the model I'm working with also in cognitive sciences and in artificial intelligence and so on, a question of knowledge which cannot be defined by distinct symbols. And this is a field opened that I think that could be very, very fruitful for psychoanalytic thinking after Lacan, because he had to think of symbolic units, distinct units, as containing knowledge. And then towards the end of his life, he says, but what if there is a knowledge of the real, where would it be inscribed and how can we? And this is a huge question for psychoanalysts, and I'm not pretending to have resolved it, but the words are not so very good, you see, anymore. Because if we use knowledge for phallic knowledge, symbolic knowledge, and so on, then we are not so well served. So I use sub-knowledge, and I use, and if you will think in neurophysiology and in terms of interconnectivity and so on, you will realize they don't mean knowledge held by by symbols in the same way that we are used to thinking.
Can I ask one more? I'd like to pursue that, but I won't. Just a related question, maybe. That in terms of descriptions or characterizations of certainly artwork of the last decade or so, the other term that, of course, you could barely pick up a catalogue essay without coming across was abject art.
You want to enrage me. Thank you very much for putting the question, John. Yeah, well, of course, for those who know the formulation of the abject historically, but mainly by Kristeva, this is a question for feminism, so I thank you. Well, the idea of the abject have to do with creating what is not me through rejection. This is the basic idea. Through a disgust and a rejection, I recognize what is not me from what is me. Now this, Kristeva called this thing that you put aside as not me, the abject, but when she's doing it, she's following in a fidèle way Lacan's objet petit a. Maybe somebody can clarify to me, but I don't see much of a difference except the affect that accompanies it, which is an affect of ich, except for that. I don't see where the model pretends something else than this kind of a cut. And Kristeva says, and this is classically psychoanalysis in its splendor, that the first time you recognize the other is through its rejection, through biting and vomiting and so on. You construct yourself as inside and the other as outside. And of course, for me, the object belongs, as feminine or as anything you want, still belongs to the phallic Lacanian model in a most classical way. And of course, what I'm saying with the matrixial is, and I'm not the first to say it in psychoanalysis, by no means, that the first awareness of the other, in the feminine in any case, in that kind of, is not through the object, is not through rejection. I do not define my territory through throwing away somebody else. And this is, of course, one of the things that brought me to even the necessity to think all that, is because I'm an Israeli, because I live a certain reality where you do have enemies, real enemies, and they need to live, and you need to live, and so on. So this has also political dimension. And the object has a political dimension which is very serious, very grave, as they say in French.
Annette.
Well, I don't know much about psychoanalysis, but what triggered me is when you were talking about the connection between two things, that actually it's whole, it's not a paradise, it's all inside the trauma of both sides. Realize that they can't be whole, or that they become apart. It's in a way it relates to what you were saying now about the other.
Yeah.
When you put two things together, it's more about yourself, how you find yourself against the other. And to make the link between that, actually, and what we're doing here, quite a lot of people in the school, we're dealing with the event. And with the event, and how different things coming together. Play together, and well, I thought it's quite interesting, the idea of actually one activity. When we're talking about activity, is defined by the other activity that happened there. But I just wonder what you have to say about that, because as it's today's life, it's about the communication that we all know what's going on. All of it's overlap all the time. Things overlap. And
Yeah.
Because I can see the sides about one and the other. There is, I think, about the combination of the two that it starts to.
Yeah, I just can say that yes, I hope that this kind of theorization helps to get into this kind of reality, which for me is very real, and which you describe, which is both internal reality but also reality of relations. But pay attention when I say, and this is a whole new discussion, when I speak about transsubjectivity, I don't speak about intersubjectivity, which is also, I mean, we need to deal with that, but this transsubjective capacity is a part of what happens in intersubjective relations. But it's not a promise that this is going to happen once we are relating. I think maybe on the contrary, because I do think it's a very fragilizing position, and many times what happens when we start to relate like that is we immediately start to define, well, that's me and that's you, and so it's very difficult to allow this dimension to take place socially, for example.
I mean, it seems to me that part of the difficulty of, in a sense, kind of speaking of some of these things is that we inherit really a kind of inappropriate kind of topography of concepts.
Yeah.
Now, you know, I mean, one characteristic of the trauma, whatever one was to think, is that in a sense, trying to assign it a position inside or out is incredibly misleading. It's not that it's both or neither. It's that the very distinction inside-outside, in a sense, is already a refusal to accept objects of a certain type, which simply kind of will not respect. Therefore, I mean, if one, in a way, it seems to me better to go back to the Greek, I mean, in the sense of trauma as wound, in precisely the fact that the topographical feature of a wound is, as it were, precisely that it is neither inside nor out. And kind of from that, one can kind of articulate a kind of recognized space for it. But in a sense, I think what sort of I was saying is that many of these things kind of require almost to borrow from some of the language of kind of architecture, of a certain contemporary architecture, in order to avoid falling into the sort of most evident topographies of kind of thought through which the comprehension then becomes much more difficult.
And that's why what he said comes to life in a way, because it is through all kind of experimentation that you can then realize and look back and say, well, what did I do here? Inside is not out and is not in, and outside is not out, and all kind. Lacan, when he started to speak about the Mobius, the topology and so on, and he experimented with ropes. I think if he would have the computers that architects are using today, he wouldn't even bother with these simple topological forms and how they handle inside and out. He will realize, maybe that, okay, this is a simple example almost. Though for us, as a way of imagining, it's very difficult to imagine. And as a way of living internalizing our history is even more difficult.
There's a question here.
Several of the concepts you brought up, you were talking about things being before and after in terms of time,
Yeah.
but also being in front of and behind
Yeah.
in terms of space, this conflation between time and space.
Yeah.
Is this perhaps a way that, if we're talking about an awareness of trauma that didn't happen personally, we inherit from a sense of historical past, that by making time into a space, we can inhabit something that's too late, or that we're too late for? A way of time traveling through space rather than through time.
If you want. But then I'm saying that you cannot do it alone. That nobody can do this traveling alone with supporting itself with one, psyche and its intra structures, which is what traditional psychoanalysis was doing. And even retreating from the outside and completely leaving aside at a certain moment the idea that trauma could be thought in terms of this exchange, and it must have been a sort of internal dynamics that compose the terms of the trauma.
Is it correct to say we will always be confronted by the manifest and the latent?
Mm-hmm.
Now, if one listens carefully or sees carefully, I found anyway that the manifest is betraying the latent.
Is betraying the latent.
Please try to,
Yeah.
I'd like to hear your opinion.
Well, I think that psychoanalysts will agree with you immediately.
What you're saying, it
Yeah.
seemed to me that that's
Yeah.
how I was hearing.
Yeah.
There is really the one speaking.
Yeah.
I mean, he says about his trauma. What he
Yeah.
says, we do not know.
Yeah.
I mean, only we hear him. And if we were to listen carefully to the artwork, I
Yeah.
found that it's betraying meaning you can read it really. You can read the false note, for instance,
Mm-hmm.
or the floor.
Yeah, this plants the question of what we are dealing with into the question of, to use Merleau-Ponty, the visible and the invisible. And to answer you, we have to look at a whole, I think, philosophical tradition of the relationship between the visible and the invisible. How they cooperate, how they betray, how they may be not related in any visible way, and so on and so on. It's a huge question, but I agree with you that this is a kind of joining, let's say, a certain tradition that says absolutely, you know, the visible and the invisible have all sorts of relationships which are certainly not exactly supportive of one another. But this is said too quickly for me. Maybe you.
Adrian.
Can't see you. Yeah.
As much broader tradition of philosophy of various kinds as it does for psychoanalysis, it seems to me. If I was thinking to pick out just a few elements which seem to me to be crucial elements of the talk, such as, for example, the concept of a partial subject,
Yeah.
and the concept of a trauma which can't be told in terms of a narrative,
Yeah.
and or something which is the unforgettable, which then can't be re-narrativized, and a number of other elements. It seems to me that they become immediate. I think this is what Derek was getting at, historiographical, in a sense which doesn't need to be tied back to the psychoanalytic concepts from which you're working.
Yeah, it's okay. I mean, it's okay with me. I say only that my responsibility, that I could answer precisely where does it get and what kind of a space it opens and where is it for or against, only in psychoanalysis, because the rest of the things I know enough and I read enough, but I'm not in any way. Yeah. Thank you.
Vulgarly called this traumatic work, in which you can actually talk about the trauma, which is the Holocaust, and then narrate everything after that in terms of what should or shouldn't happen in art, in terms of what can or can't be seen in art. And when I recognize the importance of that in terms of your work, in terms of the non-narrative, one can also see narratives that have come from belief in that as being the origin,
Yeah.
in which, say, you get these vulgarly Adorno's concept that after the Holocaust you can't have lyric poetry.
Yeah.
To a reading of yours, which seems to say that after the trauma, you can only have lyric poetry.
You must.
But we have to entirely define in terms
Yeah.
what we understand by the concept of the lyric,
Yeah.
in terms perhaps of the metamorphic, and in terms of the partial subject,
Yeah.
and in terms of the non-narratability of trauma.
Yeah.
So it seems to me that in fact it's enormously rich and optimistic in terms of a practice of art criticism.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I say that if Adorno asked how can we create after the trauma or the Holocaust for him, and the question I think paralyzed people who were trying not to deal only with aesthetic forms. It surely traumatized Paul Celan, for example, and it was directed to Paul Celan. It's a remark. There is a poem by Paul Celan that became so famous that everybody learned it in German schools. And Adorno was having a reaction towards that, and he said, "Well, you're, banalizing the experience of the trauma and so on, and you, the poet, no poetry can be based on." And no, the question is, how can we not refer? Now, this doesn't mean, as I said, that we are going to illustrate an event, whether we've seen it or not. And Paul Celan, I think he does not illustrate an event, and therefore, really, Adorno was getting at him for the wrong reason, which he regretted, by the way. 20 years after, he said, "No, I changed my mind." But it is in a piece less known than the first one.
It ties back to this question of adjective.
Yes, absolutely.
Which evolves out of the concept of this.
Absolutely. I think so, and I think that we have to become aware of the way we use the term object, what we're doing with it, and how we are so happy with it in a way. And I'm not happy with it at all. Sorry?
At the very end, you sort of quoted a bit of Levinas about the sort of the look upon the other as a position of enormous responsibility,
Yeah.
which comes into being at the moment in which you acknowledge. Link that with the kind of discussions of the gays that you've been like, because there's, what immediately springs to mind is a whole alternative ethical structure by which, as the person deploying, looking, you are totally culturally embedded without any boundaries of history or individual subjecthood.
Yeah.
Personhood and so on. So I was wondering, you said it so quickly.
Yeah, I said it almost as somebody who, I saw Levinas standing here and he will say, no, I didn't talk about aesthetics, which is what he said to me, and you can have it in the little book I brought. He said, no, I never said anything about aesthetics. I'm insisting on the ethical and so on. And so, of course, the presence of the other, which makes, for Levinas, makes me immediately ethically responsible, in a way, is not the gaze. Is not, in any case, does not depend on looking. I don't even, but that's precisely the point you're making, because the gaze we are talking about, and the matrixial gaze, is not about what I see when I look. So I agree with you, but this is a whole thing we have to do. In any case, just to make it very clear, for Levinas, the split between aesthetic and ethics is such that it is almost a horror to, so when I use the word of Levinas, I use it carefully, not knowing whether he would accept this way of putting it and this way of trying to realize this as an artist. But I think that it comes out of an idea which is a mistake, as if the artist deals with aesthetics only and the philosopher of ethics deals with ethics. Well, I think that artists are not only dealing with the aesthetics, and there are very few periods even in history of art that they could claim, and they insist that we only look at the aesthetics or whatever, and the formal and so on. It's a short period in art history, such a pureness.
Okay. Are there any other? Shall I take a last question? Okay, then
I'll ask you.
Oh.
I would like your comments, whatever you would want to say, as a kind of to illuminate a bit me.
Like taking up the last point, like about the Holocaust. I mean, I always feel kind of extremely split about this, and that I think it relates to this whole kind of notion of living in a kind of post-traumatic world. And it seems to me that one of the most appalling contemporary kind of outcomes, not of the Holocaust, but around representations of the Holocaust, is the way in which it has generalized a kind of, I don't know what you'd call it, trauma envy. I mean, it seems to me, especially in American culture, that there is a sort of fierce contest between all cultural ethnic groups as to who can be, who suffered more, who is the greatest victim. And I mean, I don't think you have to be a sort of compulsive Nietzschean, to find this a peculiarly kind of disgusting phenomenon. I mean, at this point, one does want to, and I mean it quite literally, to oppose victims. I mean, as it were, as the inauguration of a certain practice of victimhood. And it seems to me that in a way, that there is this terrible problem about representations of the Holocaust and the question of trauma around it, as to how is both one to to represent and endure it through all its kind of consequences, while at the same time kind of not traducing it by suddenly kind of, introducing everyone as a sort of survivor. The thought, you now have sort of people from English public schools kind of saying that they're survivors. It seems to me that I'm addressing it kind of probably somewhat trivially, but it requires a very, very kind of valiant and robust kind of response. Otherwise, a whole vein of difficulty, will be covered over by a sort of awful kind of slime of sort of suffering.
Yeah. I agree with you, but let's say that this also is not new. I mean, when Jesus took upon himself all the suffering for us, is another way of... so the question is not...
Well, I mean, that's one of the reasons why it was so disgusting.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So that this means that really...
I mean, you have to really...
cautious.
I mean, I would say in analytic terms, and also I think it answers Nietzsche, that you have to hate people to take on their suffering. I mean, Nietzsche kind of reprimands Dante for having put over the portals of hell, love created even me. Nietzsche said it would have been better if over the portals of heaven they had put hate created even me. And I mean, that's where, as it were, the ethics, which, as it were, begins, I think, in your terms, quite rightly, to surface, but is going to be how can I put it, a very unpopular ethics, a very challenging, kind of scornful ethics. It's not going to be about people becoming virtuous, because we know perfectly well that virtue is just another damn defense. I mean, and also then, it seems to me the kind of strategic situation of your argument in respect to art, it has to be kind of very, very pointed, as to sort of which direction it seeks to kind of push work and its interpretation. So that otherwise, there is this kind of risk of us all being somehow kind of swallowed up in a kind of global self-pity. And I think, you provide ways in which, that can be done. But in a sense, that seems to me the sort of contemporary condition in which your kind of argument enters. It's not that we have to go around binding up people's wounds.
Yeah, and that's why I said that if there is kind of a search for any kind of a paradise or hell, by the way, then this matrixial sphere does not provide either. But this was also, as Irit says, a quick remark, but it can guide us a little.
Bracha, thank you very much.